Well, thanks everybody so much for having me. Now, let me give you all a disclaimer. I am used to being uninvited to places. So I give a talk at every space like I will never be invited again. Right? So as my students say, stovall, go hard. Right? Don't let up. You're letting people off the hook, right? But before I begin, I also want to recognize the First Nations people whose land that we rest upon, and understanding in a month like February, we must remember Mankato, right? And the stories of Mankato live and exist in us because that is an American story, and an American story that is never told. So it's important to recognize where we are, where I am, and then the process of engaging. Second, I want to thank Simone Fuller and the committee for actually bringing me because, again, I'm so used to being uninvited. So when somebody is adamant with their follow-through, I'm always saying, really? Are you serious, right? So what I want to do today is kind of situate what I've seen here from MMEP, and then what some steps can be towards the future. Now, the first thing that I need to do is interrupt the notion of what you all call Minnesota nice, right? I think it's critical to acknowledge what that is. That's passive-aggressive behavior, right? That's now been induced and assumed to be culture, right? So once we get away from that, then I think we can actually start to engage things. Because in a state like Minnesota, with your population, it becomes critical to understand that. And why do I say that? In the state of Minnesota, and this is something that you all have identified, but it's not said as directly, you all have one of the most succinct school-to-prison pipelines in the country. Amen. Right? Now, that's what the data tells us, right? So you all have a state with 5 million people. You all are sixth in terms of disparities in the country. Chicago has 2.5 million people. There are 7 million people in the collar counties. So half of Chicago is almost the entire population of the state of Minnesota. Now, we're first. I don't know if there's anything to claim. But at the same time, with a state with such a small population, there has to be something that's said directly and interrupting this notion of nice. If a young person in Minnesota is black, brown, red, or Hmong, if they are not in school and they're between the ages of 5 to 18, they are in your correctional system. And it's important to understand that. Now, that data is stark. But now it becomes interesting in terms of what do we do based on what we know. And this thing around it, because this is the thing, because policy actually will allow us to understand the dynamic. But there's a second part to that, right? Now, in research communities, they say, oh, just perform the research and it's all good. But if we're operating from a justice perspective, the research is not enough, right? Because there are young people suffering, right? I got a chance to sit with the young folks yesterday and talk with them and build with them and hear their concerns. And I'm always doubly concerned when I see the nice video, but do we pay attention? Because even those high school age young folks, we pass them off in too many instances as cute, right? We give the nice smile. Oh, that's nice, right? But what about that young person who is communicating in many ways that there might be a situation that is serious, where their life and death are in the crosshairs. Not as something that is far away, but something that's very near. Now, let me get you all real upset. It's hard to regulate white supremacy in policy. Right? Now, here's the piece. Now, let's not get it twisted. When I say the words white supremacy, I am not talking about any Aryan nation or clan affiliated group. When I say white supremacy, I'm talking about a process that has assumed that people of color's activities and ways of doing and knowing is subhuman and abnormal. Now, you all have demonstrated that there is a school system that assumes that. Right? So now, what is the interruption based on what we know? Because I'm not as concerned about individual behaviors, right? Because we wrongly pass that off as this notion around someone acting racist. That's not the piece. The understanding is, how do systems operate as lineages of processes that continue to limit the access to opportunity for the groups that you all have mentioned, in this case being Black, Brown, First Nation, and some Asian American Pacific Islander groups. And we have to be specific about that. I'm always worried when I hear the language of diversity. That's safe, right? Because you can be diverse, and this crowd could be all white folks. And somebody can say, well, we're diverse. And I'll say, well, how? And they say, well, there's a diversity of opinion, religious groups, and ability. I say, well, yeah, thank you for obfuscating the point. And this becomes critically important because now we have to engage the language of race, class, gender, ability, sexual orientation, right? And in a state like yours, where this gap is significant, and let's change the language around a gap. Now, getting you all upset again. Let's call it what it is. It is a debt. Gloria Ladson-Billings says that we need to eliminate the language of an achievement gap and talk about an achievement debt. What is owed to those communities that have historically been subjugated in particular places? Now, being from Chicago, something that we all share in Chicago with Minnesota is I-94. Right? Right? And I've taken that drive before. But how many of us know the story of I-94 both in Chicago and Minneapolis? Right? This is not land development or infrastructure development under the Eisenhower presidency. This is mass displacement. Man. So now when I go to the north side of the city here and I see I-94, I say, man, that's the exact same thing that happened to Chicago to my grandmother and my aunt, right? Who were actually removed from their space by way of eminent domain, right? So now, if this is a 60-year history, why would schools be any different? Why would schools have any understanding of those folks who have been perpetually subjugated as anything else? So now, when we look at these particular issues, I'm posing a challenge, and I don't take myself out of this challenge. So when we talk about coming to work or doing work, how do we support the people who are currently doing the work, right? And something else, not just supporting them and claiming our support to them, but how do we also participate in the process while giving those folks who are doing the work their recognized expertise at the table? This becomes critical because, a PhD just means you wrote a whole lot about a little. Right? Let's put that on the table, right? Because people claim all this stuff with the funky letters behind their name, and in many cases, they know a whole lot less than what they're claiming. So now, what does it mean to get out and do some work where it's no longer safe? right? My high school students do not care that I have a PhD. All my high school students are concerned about is they got this dude sitting in front of him. It is 8th period. And if anybody, you want to test your chops as a teacher, teach 8th period to high school seniors, right? Right, let's get down, right? So if you can get down with a bunch of seniors during 8th period where your mind is across the street and you might be so bored that you want to jump out the window, you better have something that's palpable for them, right? Because if you don't, 8th period is going to be hell for everybody in that classroom, including yourself, right? So the first thing starting off with 8th period, first day of school is, well, hey, I know that none of us want to be here. But because we are, what is the work that we're engaging to do? What is the work about changing our human condition and recognizing that the ability of young people to think and create is constantly under threat? See, y'all signed a 100-year contract with Pearson here in Minnesota. Now, I'm saying to myself, how does somebody sign a contract that outlives everybody who's signing the contract? And let's go back to what researchers alert us to. And if there are any psychometricians in the house, I want to thank y'all for doing this work. What do psychometricians tell us about testing? Right? That the only thing a test is testing is how well a young person takes that test. Right? So in Chicago, we have criminalized this thing. Right? So now we have this high stakes testing and testing what we call benchmark grades that allow you, if you don't pass, you don't get to advance. So how do they do it? They give, and I was talking to young folks about this yesterday, they give 3rd graders cookies before they take the test with nothing to drink. And I'm saying to myself, wait, you're giving 3rd graders cookies with nothing to drink. So you're choking them before you give them the test. And psychometricians have identified that the testing environment is as important as the quote unquote results. So we get this twisted. So now, what is it and what is the challenge moving forward in a state like Minnesota, in cities where we have this disproportionate relationship that's historical? This just didn't come out of the sky. That's right. And it's critical to recognize that. So if we do, then what are the ways in which we think about this differently? Because the job is not to give you all the gloom and doom, right? Because I can give you all the talking and you all can leave and say, damn, Stovall came here and said we all gonna die, right? But now, to change up this dynamic, I saw something yesterday and I want to recognize them. I was able to interact with a group of young people called the Minneapolis Youth Congress, right? And I saw something very different from them that I think is critical in understanding what the next step forward in Minnesota should be. There was a little scuffle that broke out yesterday at the youth summit. And see, some of y'all like, oh, they fighting, right? And then, but if you work with young folks, that's what happens. You know, there's a beef about a relationship, and then it's a beef about what somebody tweeted or put on Instagram or Facebook, and then somebody is talking about they in love. That's young people, right? So the scuffle broke out, and these 2 guys from the Minneapolis Youth Congress stood up. They said, okay, you go find out what the beef is on this end. I'll go find out what the beef is on this end. Keep them in separate rooms. We're going to come back and talk to each other about what happened and make sure that everything is cool. Boom. 20 seconds in what many cases would criminalize those young people. So what these young folks did in 20 seconds prevented this pathway to a place that you all are very clear where young folks go if they're not in school. So now, how is that work supported? How is that work supported through policy? And I think there are a couple of things that become critically important. But here's another problem with how policies operate, especially in legislatures. Because you are on an electoral cycle, longitudinal solutions are more difficult. But now, the challenge becomes we have to think about this thing in the immediate and longitudinally. When we talk about root causes, there is no such thing as one root cause. When we're talking about racism, white supremacy, and equity disparity, we're talking about a multivariate, multi-pronged situation that is addressed in the myriad of ways. Now, have you all heard what just happened in New York City? Now, de Blasio, now he might be a one-term mayor, but man, he is going hard. I mean, I haven't seen this from a mayor's office, and then he used mayoral control to put this forward. So what did de Blasio do 2 weeks ago? De Blasio put a moratorium on charters. He put a moratorium, not just on charters, but charters and co-locations. So where schools are closed, and then another charter is brought in. So he put a moratorium on this. The money that was sanctioned for those charters, he put in pre-K. So he gave $330 million to pre-K education. Then he flipped it up again. He taxed rich folks. So he said, hey, if you're gonna live in the 5 boroughs and you're doing all this build-up, somebody gonna have to pay for this. And that could potentially be another $200 million that he's also putting in pre-K. So Bill de Blasio, in 1 week, committed $500 million to pre-K. And then he gave everybody in New York City cookies on Tuesday. So it's real, right? You can go to City Hall on Tuesday and get cookies. So one of my good friends sends me a text and says, you know, I'm about to go get them cookies, right? No, just to see if it's real, right? So they go and they get these cookies, and this guy has actually given $500 million to pre-K education, right? What we know longitudinally actually allows young people to do 2 particular things that I think is critical for a state like yours. 1, to understand their value and self-worth. 2, to engage in skill development early on, so skill development now comes at the rate that they need, not to perform on task or according to the state standards, but to make conscious decisions about their life. Right? So now this changes up the dynamic. Now, what are some things that you all can do? And I think you all are primed to do this, but it actually comes out longitudinally. Right? 1 is to think heavily about teacher pathways for the students that you all have identified. Amen. Right? It's not rocket science, right? I would encourage you all to look at the state of South Carolina and what Clemson has done. So Clemson has a program called Call Me Mister, right? So what they do in Call Me Mister, they go to high schools and and it's blatant, right? So again, ending the Minnesota nice. We need to talk directly to each other, right? No side diverted conversations. Because that's the other part of passive aggressive behavior. There's always this side stuff. And then, young folks, remember, young folks' bullshit meter is low. So when you're trying to have all these side conversations, they looking at you like, come on, man. And then you get more frustrated. And then when you get more frustrated, what happens in class? Okay, the person didn't even respect my humanity to have a real conversation. So why would I even engage in respecting them? But now you're working with power dynamics, so now that young person becomes criminalized. They become difficult. They become the challenge. They become the issue, right? So now, in inverting that, What they do in Clemson is they go to high schools, and the dean of the College of Education literally goes to high schools and says, how many of y'all want to go to college? He said, okay. How many of y'all think about teaching? And then, high schoolers, they was like, teaching? Are you crazy? Then he said, okay, let me up the ante. I'll pay for it. You want to teach? What do you think the results are? Right? I mean, and the conversation is that blatant. Right? Yo, you want to go to college? Okay. You want to teach? Okay. Folks like, yeah. He takes every last one of them. Right? Now, what does that do? It is a culture shift. Right? Not so much in terms of, because I don't want to make this assumption either. I don't want to make the assumption that just because you have a person of color in front of young people of color, that everything is going to be all right. Right? We must be sanguine and responsible to our grandmother's wisdom. Amen. My grandmother will be 98 years young this Sunday. Amen. Right? And she always talks to me. She says, child, everybody that look like you ain't you. And when I got hired at UIC, she said, child, do they know who they hired? I said, no, ma'am. She said, I thought not. Right? But this thing around, there's another step to that. So now, if we look at creating a pathway for those teachers, what must be critical in that spot is an understanding of what anti-colonial, anti-oppressive, anti-racist, pro-self-determination, pro-self-actualization curriculum looks like. Right? You all have a gift here in the state of Minnesota, and she's right here in the College of Education here at the U. Her name is Yolanda Majors. She just got here about 3 years ago. One of my former colleagues and dear friends. What Yolanda always talks about is our ability to understand literacy, not just as the processes and skills of reading, but the processes and skills of being literate of the world. Right? How do we understand our human condition? And does our ability to process that human condition prevent us from becoming further manipulated? And again, that's essentially what the Common Core says it's doing. But again, standards are always a slippery slope. So this thing around thinking about that longitudinal pathway for young folks to actually enter the teaching force, but also with a training that's justice-centered. Because teaching, by and of its nature, is pretty conservative, right? And as a good friend of mine, Kevin Kumashiro, always reminds us, we have to be honest about education in the United States. Any education for liberatory purposes has always been in spite of the system. Right? So it has never been the goal of the system to educate you. Right? And just think about all the good teachers that we had in our lives. They were always in trouble. Right? I work at Social Justice High School. It is a school full of troublemakers, and we are not talking about the students. Everybody on staff has been dumped at least once. Right? And that's a badge of honor for us. Because we say, at least we were doing something right. Right? Uninvited is never a bad thing. It may just mean that you're on the pathway towards justice. And justice is always determined by the people who have experienced the injustice, not from on high. See, it's very difficult, and not difficult, it's impossible for policy initiatives to determine justice if there's been no understanding of what is happening on the ground, right? So if you're representing anything with policy to the powers that be, you best have the understanding of what's happening in the day-to-day. As the folks from the Minneapolis Youth Congress told me, you need 10 toes on the ground, right? Not any in the air. So now, if we think about that longitudinal teacher pathway, the second thing, and this is more immediate, restorative justice is not the new sexy trend. And this is what people get into. Restorative justice, if used in a particular way, can be a way for teachers and other staff to further understand what young people are going through. And that becomes critically important. So if you're talking about a policy initiative, get restorative justice away from these external line items and hold them as harmless, internalized budgetary concerns. Right? Now in Chicago, we messed this up. We make a claim in our Uniform Code of Conduct that we engage in restorative justice, but we actually don't. And we make this claim because a couple of schools did it and did it quite well, and then they got cut from the budget. But that is the nature of how white supremacy as a system works. So very often things that work well for young folks of color are often first on the chopping block, right? We have a mayor in Chicago that says, I am not going to invest in a system where 25% of the population aren't going to do anything with their lives in the first place. That's Rahm Emanuel. You want to understand a bully? Come to Chicago, right? So this thing around how we understand these things to operate and looking at them not as these distant, etheric, imaginary things, but things on the ground. In the video, the young folks talked about love, this unquantifiable thing, right? Good friend of mine, Jeffrey Duncan Andrade, always talks about hope must be supported materially. It cannot be a hokey hope. It cannot be a hope that's in the sky. Young people have to see that we have their backs. If we do not demonstrate it, we are worse than the captors who argue for their further imprisonment. And we have to be honest about that. So again, the challenge today is to engage, to figure out the ways that we can actually engage in some work. Not the smiley, not the nice, but understanding that young folks right now in this city and in the state make a decision every day around their life or their death. If we do not understand it as that serious, we will do more of the same. And you will see that pipeline to prison grow even broader and deeper. So now, what are our politics of interruption? How do we engage in the work? Who do we partner with in that work? How do we think about these things short-term and longitudinally and not as separate entities? Again, the work is in front of us. It is not behind us. When we celebrate these victories, it is only the understanding that it means that there is more work. Because a lot of times we like to do that in policy too. We like to stop and say, hey, well, let's claim this victory. This is great. No, it's not. Because there is still a young person who is subject to these particular ways of doing and knowing, that have claimed them, that have disrespected their humanity and further marginalize and isolate them. So if we are serious, if we are talking about this in a way that makes sense, if we are ready to get 10 toes on the ground, if we are ready to ask very difficult questions of ourselves because we are engaged in situations that young people actually are doing the work of adults, and not to pathologize them, but to humanize them, because this is part of the human condition. If we do not engage that, then we have serious problems. I say this as someone who struggles with this mightily. I am not claiming that I have particular solutions. I am claiming that some days are better than others. I am claiming that a cadre of fellow colleagues, parents, families, young people I stand with because we're supporting each other. I understand trauma not as something that is distant or fake. I understand trauma as something that is real. I understand the commitment to healing as realer. So we're no longer talking about coping mechanisms. Change the language. We are talking about healing. And we're talking about our own healing in solidarity with young people and families. Right? So this thing, I don't want to give you all this false notion of a claim toward the victory here. But I do want to name a victory condition. We have to work. We have to start looking at these things not as resting in the individual, but understanding them as systemic. Root causes are not just one. They are multivariate and they are numerous. We will only do this work together as people who have identified each other to do this work. So again, there's a challenge put forward to you all today. I don't want to be dismissive, but I do want to end Minnesota nice, and I do want to support you all in your work. Because, like Harvey Milk says, I'm not bashful. I am here to recruit you in the struggle for justice. Right? So if I understand that to be true, then I need you to hold me accountable as I will hold you. Thank you all again.